Good evening and welcome to our Global Conversation in Literacy with Dr. Brian Cambourne. We are hosting tonight from Georgia State University. Your moderators for this evening's session will be Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, and me, Chrissy Pace, second-year doctoral student at Georgia State University. Global Conversations in Literacy research consists of online, interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. We are currently conducting research on the nature of technology-mediated interactions between and among participants with literacy-focused web seminars. Areas of interest may include, but are not limited to, the issues, affordances, and constraints of this technology as it relates to GCLR. For more information on our seminars, please visit our website to learn about upcoming events, including the 2011-2012 series. Here you can also retrieve information about our presenters. For anyone interested in presenting a web seminar, please contact Dr. Peggy Albers at the email address you see here. We want you to feel free to interact, so one way to do that, and I'm going to ask you to get involved in just a minute, is to use the wand to show where you're from viewing. Also, you can type questions and comments into the chat box, or you can ask questions by raising your hand. So, here you see an interactive map indicating where the participants in this global conversations are listening from. If you would, please use the wand feature that's to the left of the map to indicate from where you are listening.
We're going to try that again. Great. Thanks very much. Somehow our little arrows got confused. So go ahead, Christy.
Uh-oh. What happened now?
I think when I click on a little star, something happens. So sorry about that, everyone. I think I've figured it out now.
Great. Okay. It looks like we have a great range of participants coming from us from all around. So we'll continue now. If you have any questions or comments about the presentation, oh, sorry about that, y'all.
Somehow we're having some trouble here. I'm not quite sure why.
Okay. Well, Dr. Albers, I know when I push the button to advance the slide, it's going off.
There. Let's try that now.
Okay. If you have any questions or comments about the presentation or any of Dr. Cambourne's comments during the presentation, please type your comments into the chat area, and Dr. Albers or I will monitor these as best we can throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Cambourne will have an opportunity to address these. Dr. Cambourne began his career teaching and spent 15 years doing so in a variety of small, mostly one-teacher schools. He has since become one of Australia's most eminent researchers of literacy and learning. He is currently a Principal Fellow at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia. His major interest is in professional development for literacy education, and he is committed to the idea of co-learning and co-researching with teachers. His national and international scholarship has earned him many prestigious awards, including being inducted into the International Reading Association's Reading Hall of Fame and the Outstanding Educational Achievement Award by the Australian College of Educators. Those awards recognize his long-term outstanding contributions over many years to education. He is the author of numerous articles and books concerning language acquisition and the qualities or environmental conditions that make literacy learning possible for students in spite of the subject area or skill being learned. A bibliography containing a sampling of these titles is available on the GCLR website. Without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Cambourne and his presentation entitled Conditions of Literacy Learning Towards an Ecologically Valid, Scientifically Rigorous Theory of Learning to Read. Let's give him a virtual round of applause by clicking on the hand near the smiley faces on your screen.
Okay, Brian, you can go ahead and start anytime.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Hello? Hello? You can hear me, oh great, okay. If you look at the title of my, first of all I'd like to thank Peggy and the organisation for inviting me to give this webinar. It's a completely new experience for me, but I need to find out how all this technology works, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. If you have a look at my title slide, you can see that the title that I've given my address tonight is rather verbose and wordy, I know. But the reason that I made it verbose and wordy was that there were certain key ideas that I wanted to embed in the talk, and I thought the best way to do that was to embed them in the title. So let me talk a little bit to the title first of all, and identify some of the key words that are there that are part of the theme that I really want this address to touch on. The first key word is towards. That's a key word for me because I want to signal that I've been grappling with this idea, struggling with it for about 5 decades now. And I've never been quite confident enough to take the toward away. I'm always working towards getting the theory that I want, but I've never been quite satisfied that I've actually got there. But I think in the last couple of years I've started to realise that it may be possible soon to eliminate that term towards. So I'm working towards removing the word towards from my title. But I thought I should put it in there because it does signify the way that I've been grappling all of this time. Another key phrase in there is ecologically valid. And for me, this has 2 meanings associated with it. First of all, it connotes what I call educational relevance. For me, an ecologically valid theory should be educationally relevant, and by that I mean it makes sense to and can be used and understood by teachers and parents and students and other intelligent non-specialists. I can't see much point in having a theory which is so esoteric that only a few people who live in ivory towers can ever understand it. And I remember reading once something that Donald Schoen wrote, where he said, those who look up to the theories up on the hill of scientific research typically find they are of little use in addressing the complex problems down in the swamps called classrooms. I wanted a theory that makes sense to both those who live on the hill and those who live in the swamps, and that's what I mean by educationally relevant. Ecological validity, I think that's important. It's what my mentors in research methodology taught me years ago. An ecologically valid theory is a theory which describes what happens in the real world. So when I talk about having an ecologically valid theory of learning, I want it to be a theory of learning which describes the kind of learning that is grounded in or can be applied to real-world context, rather than those kinds of theories that I was raised on, which are restricted to psychological laboratories and to fragmented views of what learning is, and are so esoteric that often I gave up as a young teacher trying to deal with them. By scientifically rigorous, which is another key phrase, I mean it's a theory that's based on reputable scientific practice and theory building. So my talk is about those three basic ideas. I'm grappling towards a theory, which I hope I can validate. I'm looking for a theory which is ecologically valid, that is, it's relevant and applies to the real world, and I'm looking for a theory that has some kind of scientific rigour to the way it's explained and talked about, and the way it's presented. So, as I said, I've been grappling with this for quite a time now, but I'm not the only one who's been grappling. As far as I know, in English-speaking democracies such as Australia, the USA, UK, New Zealand, Canada, reading educators and the profession in general are still grappling. And in my humble opinion, two facts, which I've summarised in this next slide, support this notion. Two facts which suggest that reading education is grappling with what I call a conceptual malaise. I think the fact that reading wars have been going on for as long as I can remember, and that goes back to the 1950s, indicates that there's something conceptually wrong with our profession. Most English-speaking Western democracies, the culture of reading education is characterised by what I call ongoing turf battles and paradigm wars, which in my opinion have become increasingly destructive and counterproductive. More about that later. With respect to the second fact I've got up there, Frank Smith really upset the experimental psychology and educational establishments way back in 1983 by claiming that, and I quote, education backed the wrong horse when it backed psychology. And he went on to argue that psychology has never been comfortable with learning. I think Smith's assertions are strongly supported by some compelling evidence that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes. But first of all, let me elaborate just a little on what I call the reading wars. The next slide. As I said, the reading wars have been going on for as long as I can remember. If you go back into the history of our profession, you'll find that back in the 40s we were having arguments and debates, quite bitter and quite vitriolic at times, about different methods, method A versus method B. When I came on the scene around about in the 1950s, we were still having the reading wars, but the dichotomy had kind of shifted into what could be called look-say versus phonics. And round about the 1950s, this kind of morphed into, after Chawl's classic learning to read, this morphed into code-based versus meaning-based. And then who can forget in the 70s and the 90s, the whole language versus the direct instruction kind of dichotomy. And since the noughties began up till the present time, it's been anecdotal versus evidence-based. And these dichotomies sort of portray reading education as suffering from some kind of split personality, and I don't think they help very much at all. And it's a sign to me, anyway, that there's something seriously wrong with the profession when we have all of these fairly vitriolic kinds of arguments and debates going on, and they've been going on for as long as I can remember, which is a good half century. With respect to the other bit of evidence, what I call the competing learning theories, I I found this URL, this http psychology.org, only a couple of weeks ago, and it's very surprising. If you go in there, you'll find that there's a database in there, and the last time I looked at it, it contained at least 48 currently viable theories of learning and instruction that are out there being offered to teachers, being offered to researchers, being offered to theorists. And while some of them overlap, if we go on to the next slide, this is what that particular database looks like. And you can see there, they're arranged in alphabetical order. A whole range of learning theories that currently have some kind of recognition and acknowledgement within the broad domain of psychology. And what I find frustrating about this is that while some of them overlap, for example, you find Bruner and Vygotsky and Larve, their theories tend to overlap and have lots of similarities. There are others up there that really don't overlap and are in quite conflict. For example, Bruner and Skinner really don't see eye to eye. And so what concerns me is that this number of theories about a fundamental concept such as learning within the field of psychology is not only confusing and frustrating. For me, it must confuse and frustrate teachers no end. And it raises the question that I've got on the slide there, on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, that why so many competing theories? You know, why after more than 100 years of research and theory building in psychology, are there still such an overabundance of competing theories of learning? In other scientific domains, such as physics, biology, astronomy, evolution, and so on, after more than a century of research and theory building, broad umbrella theories which lacked either internal or external validity are typically eliminated from serious consideration. New theories evolve, and they converge towards a single set of derivative explanatory principles. Why hasn't this happened with respect to psychology? Why, after more than a century of experimental research and theory building, can the field still list such a confusing array of theories of learning? Shouldn't there have been a convergence towards a more universal, narrower range of complementary learning theories? Why so many competing theories of learning? And that's what makes me think that there's something wrong, there's something going on in psychology that isn't quite right. And this is very hard for someone like me to face up to, because I was absolutely raised within a psychological discourse framework. My whole professional career has been within psychology. And I know there are different schools of psychology, but learning is one of the key concepts within the field. And you'd think after 120 odd years of bright people really doing good research, they're not dumb, the guys who do this research. Why do we get so many conflicting and so many competing theories? It doesn't happen in other fields. So what I'd like to do is explore this in just a little more depth. Why, after more than 100 years of research and theory building, is there still such an abundance of competing and sometimes conflicting theories of learning within psychology? Well, at first glance, you could say, well, it's just an accident of history. For a complex mix of reasons in the late 19th century, education aligned itself with the then emerging science of psychology. At the time, both psychology and education were emerging as serious domains of research and theory building, and so it seemed a natural fit. After all, psychology was, and still is, defined as the science of mental behaviour. And as education and learning to read were, and still are as far as I know, perceived by most to be something that involved mental behaviour in animate beings, this sense of fit has been continually reinforced. But has the fit been a comfortable one? Historical evidence, such as that reflected by the two quotes that I've got on this particular slide, the one from Frank Smith, education backed the wrong horse when it backed psychology. Psychology's never been comfortable with learning. In a more recent publication to do with the history of psychology, Harry Heft makes the same point. He says, select any historical point during his first 120 years and you'll find psychologists embroiled in some theoretical squabble. And I invite you to go back and check the history of psychology to see whether or not these two observations have any validity, and they do. Psychology has been continually engaged in squabbles about learning. We can't seem to converge towards a single explanatory, powerful, explanatory theory of learning. And, you know, after 120 odd years to have nearly 50 theories of learning still out there for us to be choosing from, for me, is a bit of a worry. And so I've been asking myself why. The last couple of years, or about 5 years, I've been lying back, looking at the ceiling and saying to myself, why is it so? Why all of these theories of learning? What's going on in psychology? And I'm going to attempt to explain it, but I'm going to put a caveat on. In the time that I've got to explain why I think this is so, I'm going to make some huge oversimplifications. And I have to do that because of the time constraints that we've got. So here's my attempt to try to explain to you why I think Frank Smith was right, why I think we've backed the wrong horse when we back psychology. When education threw its lot in with psychology, it meant that educators had to use the discourse of psychology when we communicated and or discussed our theoretical issues and concerns. And my understanding of discourse theory is that we generally agree that the discourses which members of different scientific communities use determine how they talk, think, feel about and behave towards the conceptual content of and the conceptual relationships in their disciplines. What's even more important is that the theories they develop to explain the phenomena they're interested in are built on and shaped by the conceptual metaphors and semantic frames, and thus different scientific domains will adopt quite different perspectives when explaining the same phenomenon. So perhaps Frank Smith meant that it was the discourse which psychologists used that made it the wrong horse for education to back. Perhaps it was the discourse psychologists used that created all this discomfort with learning. And recent research and theory that I've read from discourse theory, framing theory, and even epistemology support this interpretation. So the next slide summarises and very, very definitely oversimplifies some generalisations I've made on the basis of my reading into these fields: discourse theory, framing theory, and epistemology. So here are two generalizations that I've made from my reading in the field. One is that prolonged periods of knowledge construction in different discourse communities creates different world views with respect to the same phenomena. And this in turn creates significantly different ways of knowing, thinking about and understanding the issues associated with these phenomena. So, to go on to the next slide, here are three hypotheses that I tried to test in a kind of armchair way over the last 3 years. Three hypotheses about the roles that discourse and framing play in scientific knowledge about learning. Prolonged periods of knowledge construction in such significantly different discourse communities as mainstream psychology and biology will create different worldviews with respect to learning and learning to read. This in turn will create significantly different ways of knowing, thinking about and understanding the issues associated with learning and learning to read. And so shifting from a psychological to a biological lens will provide a different, more useful perspective on learning and learning to read. And this is virtually what I did. I believe that if we could look at, say, a discourse like ecology and see what it said about learning, human learning, perhaps I would see some different discourse, come across some different ways of framing learning that would get me out of the loop that psychology had got me into for all of these years. So I went into framing theory. I read a lot of Lakoff. I read a lot of people in a field called conceptual metaphor. And to cut a long story short, this is what I discovered. When you look at learning through a psychological lens, let me go back a slide, I'm sorry. Oh no, that's all right. Stay there, stay on that slide. When you look at learning through a psychological lens, the way that learning is talked about, referred to, the language that frames it, it creates a conceptual metaphor, for me anyway, that learning is really about a change in an animate organism's behaviour that's caused by contiguously occurring external factors and events. And most of the research that you see in psychology is based on that particular view of learning. It's a change in an animate organism's behaviour, so somehow or other we have to observe that behaviour, run a treatment, observe the changes, and we can measure that change, and that change that we measure is called learning. When you look at human learning through a biological lens, you get a quite different picture of what it's about, or I did anyway. What came through my immersion in the psychological, in the biological evolution arena was that human learning is a special kind of knowing made possible by constructing meanings using a range of symbol systems. And for me, this was a quite different, if you like, frame for thinking about learning. My training as a psychologist, my training in psychological sciences, my immersion in all of the stuff that I'd done, in all of the degrees that I'd sat for and research that I'd done, I kept looking at learning, like most of us do, through a psychological lens. And when I really unpacked what it is that I understood about learning, it was that learning and all of its cognate terms like knowledge or understanding or information or know-how conceptually, I thought of that as some kind of stuff that existed independently of the learner. It existed in an expert's head, it existed in a book, and somehow or other the role of a pedagogue, the role of a teacher, was to transfer that stuff that we call learning, knowledge, understanding, information, from one source to another. It had to be acquired and stored by a learner. When you look at learning through a biological lens, it's a quite different way of framing it. Human learning there becomes the end product of a process of meaning making using abstract symbol systems. It's not some kind of stuff that you shift from one place to another. It's not words, it's not just language. Meanings are a whole range of, they can be manifested by a whole range of codes. Language is one of the codes that we can use to encode meaning, but so is art, so is feeling, so is smell, so is music, so are any kind of symbol system. Gesture, they're all ways of using symbols to create meanings, and it's not some kind of stuff that just exists independently of the learner, and it has to be somehow or other acquired and transferred, acquired by the learner or transferred by the teacher. And I found this a quite, I suppose it was a kind of epiphany for me. It was quite a different way of thinking about learning, and a quite different way of framing it from the way that I'd been trained as an educationist, mainly through the frames of psychology, and why I was so frustrated with psychological views of learning. They never worked for me when I was a teacher. And the explanatory accounts that I got for why kids in my class were failing to learn even the simplest things that I wanted to teach them couldn't really be satisfactorily explained by the psychological theories with which I'd been imbued. So framing theory helped me go into the biological field and really immerse myself in their particular discourse to see if their way of framing learning would trigger something in my mind that would help me think of it a little differently. And this next slide shows, again in a very oversimplified way, 4 conclusions I drew from trying to force myself not to frame learning from a psychological perspective, trying to unlearn, if you like, the psychological frames that I'd been so well trained by my mentors to apply to the study of learning and pedagogy, and try instead to look at learning through a quite different lens, one that I hadn't been trained in, one that I had never really studied or read in before. So I spent about 4 years really immersing myself in a whole range of evolutionary biological kinds of discourses, looking for a way of framing learning that would help me unlearn what I'd learned as a student of psychology. And these are 4 conclusions that I came to. Complex human learning, all of the knowledge, the know-how, the comprehension, the understanding that we have inside our heads, and this is all humans, is really the sum total of all of the meanings that we have ever constructed in our life. What we know is what we have made meaning about. And this begins fairly early in life. We have a lot of symbol systems available to us to construct these meanings. Oral language is the dominant one. It's the one that most human cultures rely on for most of its meaning making. But it doesn't mean it's the only one. There are other symbol systems that we've learned how to use, and we use them quite a lot. It's just that oral language is the dominant one, and it gets top billing. That's okay unless you're born as a pre-lingually deaf kid, and that causes problems. But pre-lingually deaf kids do develop the ability to communicate using other symbol systems, And they learn to read they learn to read the written form of language as well. So to me, we need to frame learning not as some stuff that we carry around in our head and we transfer from one source to another, or that we have to discover, but it's really the sum total of all of the meanings we've ever constructed. And evolution has selected the construction of meaning using symbols as a kind of species survival trait for our particular species. I think the fact that we're the only species on Earth that has this ability is a dead giveaway that evolution selected it. We're the only species that can construct meaning using abstract symbols. And it's given us a tremendous advantage over all the other species on God's Earth. Therefore, the third conclusion I drew was that learning how to mean using the oral form of language, if our species is to survive, must be as close to being as fail-safe as possible. And if you look at the cultural practices that are associated with learning how to control the dominant symbol system that as a species we have to really learn how to use, oral language, it almost is fail-safe. Even the most severely handicapped and disturbed kids try to learn language. They can't help themselves. Often they're not successful, but they try to do it. It's as if we are overwhelmingly pre-wired to make sense of the world using symbols. The survival of our species depends on us being able to do it. And so the ability to learn to talk as the dominant way of constructing meaning is hardwired into us. We can't help trying to learn to talk, and we can't help being successful at it. And so the thought occurred to me many years ago that for something Ken Goodman wrote, where he said oral language and written language are merely parallel versions of the same thing, language. I thought if learning to talk is such a successful enterprise, almost fail-safe, why can't the same kind of conditions that support it be also used to support learning how to control the written form of language? And of course, the first time I suggested that, I got howled down by the psychological establishment that learning how to talk is natural, but reading and writing are quite unnatural because no cultures ever really, not all cultures do it. And so, you know, I got a lot of flack over that, but it seemed to me to make eminent sense. And so I took those conditions of learning that I observed in kids learning to talk. When I did my doctoral work, I spent 3 years following kids around who are at different stages of learning to talk, just to look at the verbal interactions that occurred as they were doing this. And one of the things I discovered was that irrespective of what kind of socio-economic class you came from, there were certain kinds of ecological conditions in the environment that seemed to support kids' acquisition of their control over the oral form of language. And I took these along to a group of teachers I was working with, and I said, look, I just did a doctoral thesis on this. It's very exciting stuff. Can I talk to you about it? And they sort of hummed and hawed and said, oh, all right, Brian, you can tell us about it. They listened, and I said, now, can you put that into place for teaching kids to read and write? And let me watch you do it. And to cut a long story short, they let me do it, and I spent about 7 years watching teachers take a fairly bland set of conditions that I identified in a doctoral thesis and turn them into classroom practice. And it seemed to work. And so my fourth conclusion is that the same conditions which support and promote oral language learning will support learning how to mean using other symbol systems, especially reading and writing. And that's virtually what I've been on about for the last 50 years of my life, trying to work out how you can turn these particular conditions into a pedagogy that is more natural than the kind of pedagogies that I see going on in a lot of classrooms in Australia. I know they would never happen in America or Canada or UK, but we have a lot of pedagogies going on in Australia which make learning to control the written form of language a lot more complex and difficult than it ought to be, because we're not making use of what it is that evolution has hardwired us to learn. And so on the next 3 slides, I've got various, if you like, models of how these conditions might look in a classroom. This first slide I've got up now is what I call my linear version of the conditions of learning. It's an easy way to talk about how these conditions of learning to talk might really look when you are teaching kids to get control of the written form of our language. But I've since realised that it's very linear and it's not an accurate, if you like, diagrammatic representation. It's easy to talk about. And I really needed a diagram which captured the synergistic nature of these particular conditions. Hello, what's happened there? Something's happened there to my slide. This next little slide is a more accurate, if you like, visual representation of the synergistic nature of these conditions. I've got engagement at the core because you can't learn from a demonstration in a context in which you may have been immersed unless you are engaged. So what I'm going to do is shift you back to the linear version. You're aware that the other versions of that diagram follow, but I find this one easier to talk to, and I'm going to do a quick run through, if you like, of what these conditions mean using this linear model that I've got in front of you. First thing I need to point out is that all of these conditions interact and impact on each other, and they're not in any order of significance or any order of priority. But as is the convention, I'm going to work from the top down and do a quick overview of what each of these conditions mean for me, and leave it to you to make the connection to how you might teach reading or writing. So when little kids are born, it doesn't matter what culture they're in, they are immersed in a culture which has control of the oral form of language. I think last time I looked there was something like 6,000 spoken languages on Earth. So you don't know what culture you're going to be born into, but you're born into a culture which is already using a living language. And as a newcomer to that culture, your job is to learn it. And you, for most of your waking time, you are immersed in, you are bathed in, you are saturated by the sounds and rhythms and cadences of that particular language. And you may not have a clue about what it means, but the tones and the rhythms and the sounds and the patterns of that language are going past your ear, and you're listening to them. And I think it's significant that early childhood people have found that when kids get to the babbling stage, they actually babble in the language that they're learning, which suggests to me that they're engaging very closely with this particular mode of communicating, even though that they don't know anything about it. But as well as immersion, you receive lots of demonstrations of how it's used. Parents and caregivers are constantly using the language in meaningful contexts around newborn members of the community. The newborn members of any culture receive thousands of demonstrations of how the language is used and what it's supposed to be used for. And, you know, I'm a great believer in Frank Smith's dictum that demonstrations are the raw material of learning. everything we've learned, all the knowledge we've created, we learn from demonstrations of some kind. And demonstrations can either be artifacts or they can be actions. And Mum and Dad sitting at the breakfast table having breakfast, and Mum opens her mouth and says, pass the butter, please, is a demonstration of what that string of words means in that particular context. And the 2-year-old sitting at that table is going to engage with some aspect of that demonstration. And they get literally thousands of those kinds of demonstrations through their waking time, and that's how they start to get control over the system that ultimately the culture expects them to be able to use and communicate with. And when those demonstrations aren't available, or they're flawed, or they're faulty, learning to talk becomes that much more difficult, as it does for prelingually deaf kids. They don't get that kind of immersion. They don't get that kind of those kinds of demonstrations, and so learning to talk becomes a much more complex enterprise for them until they discover a different coding system. But nevertheless, they still do it. Expectations. Little kids are never given the message that this is too hard for them. In fact, they get very strong implicit messages that learning to control this particular way of communicating is simply not negotiable. You can't opt out of it. If you want to become a member of this culture, you have to really be able to learn this particular way of communicating, and not only that, you're capable of doing it. I've never, in all of my research, and I did spend a lot of time bugging kids as they learn to talk, I never heard a parent give the message that learning to talk is too difficult for you, kid, we better put you in the remedial class, or get you into a remedial loop straight away. They don't do that when kids are learning. We don't do that when kids are learning to talk. Somehow or other, some of us do it when they're learning to read and write. Our responsibility, when little kids are learning to talk, they're given some choice in what aspect of the demonstration they will engage with. We don't all suddenly sit down one day as parents or caregivers and say, oh, this week we're going to teach our kid the negative transformation. We're going to teach them how to say no or not. Kids would rebel. Learners wouldn't tolerate that. They're given some freedom about which part of the demonstration of how to use this system that they will engage with. For some reason or other, many in reading education don't think you can do that with the written form of language. You must you must present it in a lockstep, fragmented way. Every kid learning full stops on the same day. Once we take that responsibility away from learners, we turn them into dependent learners who are so dependent on being told what to do that they virtually can't think for themselves. Youth, when little kids are learning to talk, they're given thousands, millions of opportunities to try themselves out. We don't say to them, hey kid, you've got to wait till you've got it all under control before you can utter your first sentence. In fact, we provide opportunities for them to have a go, to approximate, to try themselves out. I know when I was a young father, and my eldest, who is now nearly 50, was about 10 months of age, and he stood up in his crib and pointed at me and said, "Duh." I ran next door and got the neighbours and said, "Come and listen to my kid. He just said, there's Daddy. He's very bright. He's got language under control already." I didn't say, oh my God, he's got it wrong. I better put him into some remedial class straight away, or break down the learning task into even more simpler kinds of subtasks. I didn't move into a lockstep way of teaching, and no caregivers or parents do that. It's as if we're pre-wired on how to respond to help learners learn how to control this way of communicating. It's as if evolution has taught us how to do it. We honour kids' approximations. We don't say, hey kid, you're wrong. We encourage them to make mistakes. Baby talk is a period of talk that all kids go through. What you guys call invented spelling, what we in Australia prefer to call temporary spelling, is a good example of that. And we honour those approximations. You know, when little kids are learning to talk and they do something in baby talk, like saying, "Dat, daddy, cup," we honour that. We acknowledge that. If it is a cup, it's as if we think to ourselves and say, "Hey, the baby just pointed at a cup and said, 'Dat, daddy, cup.'" Now that's bad grammar, that's bad English, that's bad pronunciation, but the meaning's right. I'm not going to correct his grammar or correct his pronunciation. What's the best thing I can do? I can respond in a way which runs the demonstration by him again or her again. And so we usually say, "Yeah, that's Daddy's cup." And we let the child engage again with another demonstration. And that's how they shape their baby talk up to become up to the standard that we accept in our culture. Baby talk drops out. And it doesn't drop out because we give them lots of remedial sheets or put them into a remedial class. So what I'm suggesting to you is that perhaps nature has already worked out what our pedagogy is. If you go on to the next slide that I've got here, it's what I call my Spiderweb slide. It's exactly the same content as the previous slide I've just been talking to, but it's a more accurate visual representation. It captures the web-like synergistic nature of the whole process. I don't want to give the message that I obviously gave one group of teachers once who I talked about how kids learn to talk, and this dear old infants mistress said to me, "Oh, I love your conditions of learning, Brian, all except that one about approximations. I'm going to put them all into place except that one, and I'm going to make sure the kids never approximate because I don't want to reinforce wrong responses." I realised that that previous linear diagram led her to that conclusion, that these conditions were discrete, separate conditions that existed and didn't interact with each other. They were quite separate. So that's when I moved into this particular kind of diagram here. It's the same message, but it's more visually accurate, I think. And this next diagram is another version, if you like, of these conditions of learning being put in place, if you like, in a classroom. The conditions interact with the kinds of strategies that teachers use if they believe in this model of learning, and the kinds of processes that they set up in their classroom. And that's a diagram which you can learn more about if you get hold of an article that I think I wrote for Reading Teacher back in 1995, which describes how this particular diagram actually works. But the message is the same. It's, let's look at what it is that nature has selected for our species to apply to our mastery of meaning making, and see if we can turn it into a pedagogy. And which brings me up, if you like, to my final slide, where this is a quote that I've taken from a discipline called biomimicry. Biomimicry is a field of science which has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years. It's the brainchild of a scientist called Janice Benyus. That's her name there that I've got on the slide. And basically biomimicists are hard-nosed scientists who are saying, look, the problems of the world is facing now of sustainability and preserving the ecology are problems which science needs to answer. But we think if we go back into evolutionary history, we'll find that evolution has found out a way of, nature has found out a way of dealing with these problems. And one of the examples I can remember is, air conditioning a huge building in ecologically sustainable ways. And a group of scientists who are biomimicists went to nature, and they found that the ants that build those huge anthills in Central Australia had solved the problem of how you air condition a huge building using quite simple but effective science. So biomimicists go back into evolution and say, has nature faced this problem of engineering or sustainability before? Yes, I think it has. What principles can we learn from how nature has solved the problem to addressing this problem? Well, I think the same can be applied to our social sciences. I think the reading wars and the pedagogical wars that are going on are issues about learning which I think nature has already faced up to. And this is what I learned from going into the evolutionary theory and the biology theory. I came to the conclusion that's summed up in this quote. When you do this, when you go to nature and say, has nature addressed this issue before? Let's have a look and see how she's done it. This is the conclusion you come to. We can see more clearly than ever before how nature works her miracle. Certainly learning at the Homo sapiens level is a miracle. Well, how does nature do it? When we stare this deeply into nature's eyes, it takes our breath away. And in a good way, it bursts our bubble. We realise that all of our inventions have already appeared in nature in a more elegant form and at less cost to the planet. So what I'm arguing, what I'm positing, is that perhaps nature has already developed a theory of learning how to read. And it's the theory that is summed up, if you like, by how successful we are in learning to control the oral form of the language. And I think there's enough evidence around now to dispel that old furphy that written language is an artificial invention. It's just another way of making meaning using symbols, which is what nature or evolution selected for us to give us the advantages that we've had. So let me stop there, let me close there, and throw it open to our moderator. Thank you all so much for your attention and for letting me pontificate so much. Bye now.
Let's all give Brian a virtual round of applause. Could we do that for his invigorating and exciting session? Brian, the chat area has just been filled with all sorts of questions, and it's now 7:58, so we actually have time for probably one question. And for those of you who are interested in asking Brian Cambourne a question, perhaps you could email it to him. We have his email address on the Global Conversations and Literacy website. Brian, the one question that we have, actually there's so many, but what sense do you make of Gunther Kress's ideas of multimodality and communication in young children's writing? Have you got some familiarity with that? You can go ahead and answer that if you'd like, Brian. You need to turn your mic on, Brian, if you're trying to talk.
Okay, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes,
Hello.
We can hear you, Brian.
I said I'm familiar with Dr. Kress's prolific writing, but I haven't kept up with it. But basically, I think we're on the same wavelength, that there are multiple ways of making meaning, and we should honour all of them in pedagogy. And I think I don't know how many of you have seen the movie that won the Academy Award, The Artist. I saw it yesterday, and to me it affirmed everything that I've just said about our ability to construct meaning using a whole multimodal range of symbol systems. I think it was a brilliant movie that illustrated just how multimodal we are and can be almost effortlessly.
Looks like we might have time for one quick question, Brian. Apparently one of the articles that you've written is being used for the Common Core state standards here. Did you know that, and what is your response?
Yvonne Sui Runyon told me about that, and it's true. It has been cited as justification for a particular approach to pedagogy, which last time I looked at the way it was being used was not an accurate, in my mind anyway, an accurate depiction of the way that I intended it to be used. And I did write to the committee telling them that it was a misinterpretation of my work, and it was a good example of what I think statisticians called confirmation bias, that whoever read it used it to confirm a bias that they'd already had and applied it in a way that to me was quite not what I intended at all. So I am aware of it. I'm not sure what they've done with it since. I did get a polite response saying they had received my memo that it was a misinterpretation, but I'm not sure what's happened since.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Yeah. That's all the time we have for questions. And Christy, will you go ahead and take over?
Sure. Please join us for our next web seminar on Sunday, April 1st, when we will be hosting Dr. Candace Kuby, and she presents Tensions from Analyzing Children's Images of Racial, Thus Segregation, Searching for Tools. Then, following in May, is our final presentation of the 2011-2012 series, where we will host Dr. Sharon Murphy. And as you can see, global conversations and literacy topics cover a wide range of interests, and so we hope that you are able to join us as often as possible as these leaders in the field of literacy share their knowledge, research, and expertise. And we would just like to take a minute, one more opportunity to thank all of you for sharing your Sunday with us, and thank you, Dr. Cambourne, for your insightful presentation. We truly appreciate your attendance, participation, and most importantly, your interest in these most important discussions about literacy and learning. Please take a moment to type in one thought about this web seminar. It might be something about the content, the online platform, or anything else that you have a question about or maybe you enjoyed. Also, please consider taking the 10-question GCLR survey. And if you'd like to be interviewed as part of our research study, we encourage you to type your name into the chat area, and we will contact you to schedule a 15 to 20-minute interview. Again, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful Sunday evening.